On Tuesday, November 8th, Michigan voters will be casting their ballots for candidates in the office of Governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, United States Congress, State Senate, State House. Local offices will also appear on the ballot, and 3 proposals will be considered. The brothers from the Detroit Alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated will be sharing with you today their perspectives on why it's important to engage and vote in the November 8th gubernatorial election. Let's check them out and see what they got to say.
I think the fraternity has played a huge role in elections, primarily education of voters, voter registration, voter engagement, both from in my role as an alumni member, as well as when I was an undergraduate and having voter registration drives on campus.
The first election I participated in was 1963. I had just turned 21. Most people don't remember that you had to be 21 to vote. It wasn't until 71 that they declared that you could be 18. And a lot of things had occurred during that time, including, I believe, the death of Kennedy. And so I voted in that election. I was continuing the legacy of my grandparents and my parents.
2008, when Barack Obama was on the ballot, we were all overcome with emotions. Our emotions were going everywhere, and I cried. I was in a friend of mine location, and the place was packed. It was a bar. All the TVs was on, and it was a historic moment because many of us thought that we would never see this in our lifetime.
Well, I actually think my fondest memory came before I actually was legally able to vote, because I would go to the polls with my grandmother and my mother every year. We used to go to Tri-Stone Church on Woodrow Wilson, and I would walk with my grandmother and my mother. And one of my fondest memories was in 1990. And that was the year that Governor Blanchard lost because we stayed home. And my grandmother taught me a valuable lesson about why every vote counts.
When I first voted, I was 18 years old. I voted at a church on Dexter and Davison, and my mom had told me, hey, that's the same church that your uncle and your auntie got married in, so it was kind of cool. You know, I was 18, I was a little nervous, but at church on Dexter and Davison.
I was 18 and I was in Jersey. It was the presidential election for Carter versus Reagan, okay? And it was important to me because I understood the sacrifices that those who came before me did.
My mom and dad from South Carolina, they grew up in the Jim Crow South where they could not vote. And so on both sides of the family, were educators. And so voting was a birth law, if you will, in our family.
These elected officials can make substantial differences in the lives of you and your loved ones, and it's vastly critical that we make sure we get the right people in office.
I thank you for the opportunity to include our fraternity in such an important matter. We have to get this word out there, and I hope that others will follow your lead and follow our lead and continue to vote. Thank you.
Elections are important on all levels. Sometimes we forget the fact that even though on a national level they set the agenda, on a local and state level is where that money is distributed and how that agenda is enforced.
When black people in particular had to identify how many marbles were in a jar in order to vote, or how many bubbles was in a bar of soap to vote, And so that's the reason why it's so important, because now we have perhaps a more sophisticated means, in my opinion, of identifying how many marbles are in a jar, by virtue of the fact that we have persons who want to decide as individuals whose vote will count and whose vote will not count. I think we here in the state of Michigan needs to understand that that's just a more sophisticated way of saying how many bubbles in a bar of soap.
I think it's so important that we all understand our history. And I talked about it earlier in terms of the democracy and folks who sacrificed their lives or their families to be able to, for us to be in a position to vote, to understand what our rights are. And we're standing on those folks' shoulders. They had the courage to do it. And you have to be able to look in the mirror and say, if you were back in that day and age, would you have that same courage? Most of us would say, unfortunately, if they were honest, wouldn't have that same kind of courage. We'd like to think we would, but when the test is put to us, do we really? And so it's for those who came before us, we can't forget. And we don't have any other government. We don't have any other world. And so it's up to us to come together and make the government the best government it can be, and the world the best place for, not just for us, but those who come behind us, like those who we came after did for us.
You've heard from the men of the Detroit Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. They've given you a plethora of reasons why you should engage in the November 8th gubernatorial election. Exercise your right and keep our state fit. Yo.